Hi everyone, and welcome to our Civil podcast. Today we have a special session dedicated to Global South, and we are going to discuss the following topics: tendencies in the Global South and narratives that dominate the region, key power players and their tactics to dominate the region, what tools are used by Global South to push their own issues to the global agenda. With that said, I would like to introduce our distinguished guest, Gustavo de Carvalho, who is a senior researcher on African governments and diplomacy at the South African Institute of International Affairs, and an international relations consultant with over 2 decades of experience. His work focuses on multilateral forums, global economic architecture, and the geopolitical dynamics shaping Africa's role in the international order. Gustavo, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Let's start from the beginning. What tendencies in the global south you're seeing right now, and what narratives dominate the region right now?
I think it's important when we're thinking about what the global south is. I think we need to make some clarifications. It's certainly not a homogeneous geographical regions. It's what some academics would call a meta region, because effectively what it does is to put together a number of countries from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia that have similar experiences in terms of colonialism, in terms of being often in the margins of international economic decisions and political decisions internationally. And I think what we've seen within this broader idea of what the global south is, there is a renewed sense of confidence. There is a sense that a lot of countries within the global south are growing faster than what they used to. The distance between some of these countries and the developed countries categories tends to be much smaller now than what perhaps it was a couple of years ago. But the challenge when that happens within a global order that is not only fragmented, but it also is particularly confusing for the players in terms of how to navigate. And I think the big trend in that regard that we see within the global south, it's a very active pursuit of autonomy, that it's able to navigate this fragmented global order, the tension between major powers, and to ensure that the global south is able to not only survive this particular period, but also even thrive.
And what about such organizations as BRICS and etc.? What key roles they play right now in global south?
I think institutions like BRICS are quite symbolic to the space in which global south countries want to be part of, and for a number of reasons. One of them, and I think it's clear that perhaps not all countries of BRICS are part of the global south. Russia, certainly not. China has a bit of a,
Yeah.
sometimes it feels it's part of, sometimes it's not part of. But irrespectively of that, if we're looking to how an institution like BRICS was created in the immediate aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, it has all to do about having a voice, building a platform that provides its members the space in which allows them to have a stronger voice in international institutions, and particularly international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. Since 2009, when the first BRICS summit was held until now, the most consistent topic of discussions and of decisions within BRICS itself, it is about their own participation and the need for more equitable international organizations. And I think to a large degree, that helps to break somehow the narrative that we often hear about BRICS is that BRICS is there to change the global order. I think in reality, when we're looking to those decisions, BRICS countries want to be part of that order. And I often use this analogy. If we are talking about, and maybe using more carnies to start with, that if you're either at the menu or on the table, I think what it becomes clear to me is that countries of the global south are not necessarily looking into eating in a completely different restaurant, but they want access to that
Yeah.
restaurant. They want to be able to make the choices. They want to be able to eat the food, and they know perhaps the more that they do, they're going to have to start helping with cooking and cleaning as well. That I think is fundamentally, I think, what brings these countries together. It is the fact that within the space of the post-Second World War global order, in which privileged those winners of the Second World War, but fundamentally what it did, it replicated a lot of views of the world that many of these countries had. The problem is that that global order that existed very different than what it is today, did not fully account for countries within the global south. Most of us were still colonies when the Second World War ended and the United Nations was created. So I think to a large degree, though many of those institutions, what effectively they do is to pool resources, to bring countries together, to bring perhaps very different countries together that have very limited in common in terms of history, in terms of culture, but at the end of the day, see themselves in a similar structural position of marginality. And how do you do that? Often, one of the ways is by strengthening and in the creation of institutions like BRICS.
And what about the latest incidents that happened with Maduro, with different narratives floating around Nigeria? How does it actually impact Global South? Even though these are different countries on different continents, the approach to them is still the same. And do they feel safe? What kind of pushback they have towards what is happening now?
I think very few countries at the moment feel fully safe, and I think partially it has to do with a very change of behaviors of countries like the United States, countries like Russia, in terms of their own immediate vicinities, and this idea of the establishments and the sustaining spheres of influence is certainly something that is back within the narratives of the United States in rebringing an idea of a Monroe Doctrine of the 1800s that used to talk about this idea of the American continents for the Americans, really seeing the American continent as part of the backyard. And the same with these ideas of the near abroad that we see very present within Russian foreign policy as well. I think that the question for a lot of countries within the global south, one, I think it is, do we align with one of those sides or not? And I
Yeah.
think the answer for many is that while they're quite big on their own, no major global power, not the US, not China, not Russia, not Europe, are entirely that big that they're able to provide all of those things that we want and need. It is about how do we provide a space in which these countries can engage within a global order that allows them to maximize what is really their position, their role, and their ability of actually gaining elements from that. Of course, within a space where territorial integrity, where the role specific regions and countries, I think that makes it much harder for countries within the global south to do that. And I think the response that we've seen so far that is very clear to me, it is one of diversification, is the one of increasing the number of players. And that is when we start not necessarily looking entirely into those more traditional, bigger spaces of influence and power, like Europe, like the US, like China, and so on, but really starting to look into one another. For me, one of the biggest geopolitical moments of 2025 was the ASEAN summit in Malaysia. It
Mm-hmm.
is always an important event in the region, but in particular, when you see the representation of heads of states from different parts of the world, whether from the developed countries, whether from the global south, it really shows that we're all trying to find ways of not really gearing too much towards one pole, one center of power, because that in itself feels very risky. It's about not keeping all of the eggs in the same basket. You start diversifying those baskets and finding new ways that makes it perhaps complicated in many ways in terms of norms, in terms of values, but it feels to many as necessary.
And what about it actually brings
Can I,
us to another question
sorry,
about
can
the
I pause
power.
for
So it brings us to another question about the power play in the region. So basically, we've seen China strengthening its ties with global South Russia, and it seems like right now it's another player, United States, which has reemerged and tries to make some ties with global South, get its influence there. What about power players right now? How do they feel? Because I think Russia is somewhere on the suburbs, and China and United States are seeing this global South area as a new table for negotiation or even for competence. What do you think about that?
I think often when we think and perhaps if you use Africa as an example, I think it's a very useful one because often the narrative presents almost as if the age the agency always comes from the global power. That global powers are interested in that. Therefore, they're going to have a new scramble for the continent. I think in reality, you have a mix of both. You have the power play that comes from the outside, and all of these major players that are coming into the continent. China is the largest bilateral trading partner of most African countries, and is the largest, as an aggregate, is the largest bilateral partner of the entire continent. But it's followed by countries like India, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the US, France, UK, Brazil, Thailand, Russia. All of these countries, in a way, are coming here. And I think perhaps the mistake that we make is that as if African countries are not necessarily making their own calculations. They know they have a number of choices in terms of engagement and partnerships, some of them more benign, some of them more complicated, some of them more unidirectional, some of them much more deep and complex. And I think largely the part of the negotiations that exists around that, and I think particularly why it's different to what we had seen in previous decades, is that we are in a space where those multiple choices are seen by many as not necessarily mutually exclusive. There will be situations where the engagement with the Chinese may be particularly beneficial, whether it's in terms of the development of certain infrastructures, of railways, of ports, and so on. There may be instances where, from a normative and values point of view, voting similarly to what European countries do within certain United Nations discussions, whether it's on human rights, whether it's on issues related to the role of regional organizations, then we may see a stronger connection with European countries in that sense. And I think what we've seen with the United States in particular, that predates Donald Trump. I think if we're looking to the biggest geopolitical space and project that the United States currently has in the African continent, it has to do with the building of the Lobito Railway corridor between Angola and Central Africa, very much as a part of like this increased corridor for demands for critical minerals and so on. And I think what we see is that countries are really trying to figure out, both from the recipient end, in terms of how do we maneuver all of those relations and conflicting interests that often occurs, but at the same time, how do we maximize the benefits that these relationships can bring? And I think in doing that, the challenge that it becomes is that you need to maintain, to a large degree, a high level of pragmatism around that, and often picking and choosing what arguments do we engage, what disagreements do we pursue, how do we agree to disagree with other countries. That is relevant for countries within the global south, but it's particularly relevant for countries within the global north as well. I think if we look into the EU, European Union, Africa Union summits that occurred 2-3 months ago in Angola, for me was quite an interesting one, because for one of the first times that I visibly see that when we're talking about Europe-Africa relations, it's not simply about Europe in Africa, but it increasingly becomes about how Europe as a continent and Africa as a continent, with all of its internal and diversity that exists, how do we see the world, and how do we create means that makes us to be able to survive within a space that is very complicated at the moment. And I think that is important for countries within the global south, because the choices that are made in that sense are made beyond just, do we like this player more than others? Are we closer friends with this side or another? And it becomes one that is, in a way, selfish, because you're looking into yourself and into your region, but you're also looking for means in which that those very complex and often really difficult to maintain multiple relationships are able to be sustained and to be helpful, rather than being another source of keeping countries in the global south within the periphery of global decision making.
And is there any kind of countries who already know that they would like to side beside one player rather than another? Because we have also countries who are at the active conflict, like Sudan. And what should they do? Because it seems like there are some of them who are siding with Russia, another with China, another with American side. And who is winning? Is there any kind of winner, or is it just all around the place? People just try to maneuver between these players, and that's all.
I think it depends. I think it's a good question, but to a certain degree, if we look into a country like Sudan, bringing your own example here, I would say everyone is losing, right? Because you're in a situation where there is a major armed conflict ongoing with a number of players, whether we're talking about the UAE, Israel, the US, Russia, all of those players in a way being present and part of a conflict that it's intrinsically domestic, but with a strong external influence, both in terms of support to different parties, but particularly in terms supporting the continuation of those particular conflicts. So I think, but if we look at large, it's pretty hard to say whether we can find winners within the continent and winners outside of the continent, precisely because it's a process that it's still evolving. I don't think we're yet in a moment where the situation is stable enough and we have a very clear picture of who are more influential than others. I think perhaps what I wanted to end this question with is the most important one is if we're talking about who should be winning within this process, should be countries within the global south itself.
Yeah.
The idea there is how do we make those relationships to be somehow a win-win, where there is not only about one side winning, the other side losing. How do we manage that differences of power that often creates really difficult decisions to be made, but also noticing that the global south, like the global north, is not a homogeneous region. So certain countries are going to find that it is more convenient to them and it's more beneficial to them to position themselves within a space where they are closely connected to one side or another. I think if we look at countries like Argentina at the moment, or even countries within the global north that have different connections with the United States, some are closer, some are further. And same, I think, with other countries like China or like Russia, where there is that attempt. But I think primarily if we're looking to some of the major players within the global south, whether it is Brazil, whether it's South Africa, whether it is Indonesia, whether it's Turkey, all of us, all of these countries are effectively seeing the world in a way that we cannot necessarily entirely put all our eggs within one basket, because at the end of the day, if we perceive that any of these big powers, whether it's China or whether the US is being sufficient, the choice, even if we don't love it, would have been much easier to be made, because at the end of the day, you see yourself as not as an alternative because it's either or, but you identify specific elements between those different sides. And I think that is where perhaps as the situation evolves in the coming years, we start seeing that much more from the lenses and eyes from those countries that are effectively often seen as just being passive recipients of external influence. And I think in reality, this is what going to give us a much better understanding on how beneficial or damaging this current new environment is for countries within the global south.
This is very interesting, and it actually brings me to another question. How do these countries put their own agenda on a global stage, even without BRICS or without these organizations? How do they tell more about themselves and push their interest on the global stage?
I think there is a number of steps for countries to better project their needs and wants. I think first of them, I think it's clear that the use of international organizations and multilateral institutions is a very important tool towards that. We've just seen here in Africa, the Africa Union Summit, and a very strong focus in terms of attempting to increase the capacity of African institutions of dealing with African issues. That is very much the driver of an institution like the Africa Union since 2002 when it was created. That a motto that it becomes so important, it becomes almost cliche within the continent under this idea that we need to develop African solutions for African challenges. I think the important thing for initiatives like this is that they are not necessarily because we need to do it, no one else should be here.
Yeah.
I think it's much more about developing African solutions to African challenges because and when the international community is not willing or able to intervene in the way that we feel that is necessary. This was very much the idea that came out of the genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s, the conflict in Somalia in the 1990s, that showed to the international community at large that our institutions perhaps often ill-suited for those responses, but it showed to Africa in particular that we need to do more in terms of doing that. And how do you do that? You develop common positions when possible. You create common platforms in which continent and regions, and the broader global south can become more active, but also in a way that you bridge this multilateral space in terms of how national interests are defined, but particularly how national interests are projected in that sense. And I think that second aspect for me in particular is the most important one, because it provides a space to look much less about the short-term immediate processes and results that you may get from different relationships, but you become much more intentional in how you're negotiating with external partners, how you're bringing countries within your region that may have common and similar positions to strengthen your individual voice. We need to remember that if we look into the United Nations with all of its flaws and credibility issues at the moment, it's still largely an organization composed by countries of the global south. Of course,
Yeah.
the most important decision-making body of the UN, the Security Council, is still not particularly representative of the current configuration of power internationally. It's still very much a snapshot of what power plays and power divisions occurred in 1945 at the end of Second World War. And that is very much where I think countries are looking to engage with at the moment. On the one hand, there is still a strong belief that those institutions, whether it's the United Nations, they may be terrible in some ways, but we don't have anything better to fully replace it. So we still feel that it's beneficial to us to fully engage with that. But also finding ways in which our own sub-regions are growing on their own and in a way really becoming some of the biggest drivers of development. We see that very clearly in Southeast Asia, where ASEAN really plays an important role in terms of increasing the diversification process of these economies and really carrying that process of large economic growth. We see that in Africa, for instance, with a lot of focus, not only in the creation of what can become eventually the largest free trade area in the world, the African Continental Free Trade Area, but particularly one that starts looking more and more into the issue of added value of and the increasing complementarity of African economies. And that is not an ideological process simply because we like our region, but I think
Yeah.
is that what we see in a lot of our regions within the global south, our immediate regions within the global south, is that is very clearly to many of us the new frontier of growth. If only 14, 15% of all trade that African countries do is intra-African trade, in comparison to the 40, 50% in other regions of the world, it's obvious that there is something that we can exploit here, and proximity in that sense means a lot. So I think engaging with those different levels and tiers and spaces, I think it's fundamentally important, and it's certainly going to continue to be evolved over the years, and hopefully in a way that really we start seeing better results and benefits for our own regions.
Great, great. It was really a pleasure to talk to you. Any kind of closing remarks about Global South and development before we go?
I wanted to close and first to thank you for this opportunity, but I think it's a reflection on the importance of the global south when we're thinking about international relations. Of course, in a world that it's a little bit more difficult, is a little bit more depressing at times in terms of some of the developments that we see internationally. But the idea of the global south is not simply an ideological one. It's one that actually plays an important role within the imagination of our leaders and our political establishments when they are thinking about the role of our regions and how do we use that to improve our own development and growth. And I think by looking through those lenses, we perhaps stop looking into that less about the global south being part of the menu and someone is going to have that lunch or that dinner, but much more as an important player that has something to offer, that has something to say. And I think as the time progresses, we're going to see more of the confidence that is palpable to many of us in our regions, but one that starts bringing more tangible results to all.
Thank you, Gustavo. This was a very great conversation. For our listeners, please subscribe to our channel and also visit Gustavo's profile on LinkedIn that we will attach to our recording. And stay tuned to more podcasts by Oslo. Thank you.